A single stolen mule. That's all it took to ignite the deadliest family feud in Arkansas history. Before the sun set on that bloody October day in 1893, 14 men would lie dead in the streets of Carrollton, their bodies riddled with bullets, their blood soaking into the dirt roads of what was supposed to be a peaceful county seat. The Shelton brothers didn't come to talk. They didn't come to negotiate. They came with Winchester rifles, Colt revolvers, and a thirst for vengeance that would turn a courtroom into a slaughterhouse. This is the true story of how a farming dispute escalated into one of the most brutal massacres in American frontier history. A day when the Arkansas hills ran red with blood, and an entire town learned what happens when you cross the wrong family. Before we dive into this shocking tale of revenge and violence, make sure you're subscribed and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our deep dives into history's darkest moments. Drop a comment below telling us what historical event you want us to cover next. Now let's go back to 1893 Arkansas, where a simple theft was about to spiral into unimaginable carnage. Carroll County, Arkansas in the 1890s was a place where a man's word was his bond, and his property was sacred. Nestled in the rugged Ozark Mountains, this was a land of subsistence farmers, tight-knit communities, and unforgiving terrain where every mule, every acre, every resource meant the difference between survival and starvation. The Shelton family, headed by patriarch William Shelton and his sons, were hard-working farmers who had carved out a modest existence in this unforgiving landscape. They weren't wealthy by any means, but they had something far more valuable in these parts: pride, reputation, and the respect of their neighbors. But in the summer of 1893, that respect was about to be tested in the most explosive way possible. The trouble began, as it so often did in the rural South, with a boundary dispute. The Sheltons owned a work mule, not just any mule, but a strong, reliable animal that was essential to their farming operation. In an agricultural economy where mechanization was still decades away, a good mule was worth its weight in gold. It could plow fields, haul timber, and perform the back-breaking labor that kept a family fed through the harsh winter months. When that mule went missing, the Sheltons immediately suspected their neighbors, the Pattons. The Patton family had been involved in an ongoing land dispute with the Sheltons, one of those festering conflicts that plague rural communities when property lines are unclear and surveying is imprecise. Words had been exchanged. Threats had been made. The kind of low-level hostility that, in most cases, eventually fizzles out or gets resolved by community elders or local law enforcement. But this was different. When William Shelton confronted the Pattons about the missing mule, he was met with denial, mockery, and, according to some accounts, outright aggression. The Pattons not only refused to return the animal, but essentially dared the Sheltons to do something about it. In the honor culture of the rural South, this was more than theft. It was a direct challenge to the Shelton family's standing in the community. To let such an insult go unanswered would be to invite further degradation, to mark themselves as weak, as families that could be pushed around without consequence. William Shelton did what any law-abiding citizen was supposed to do. He took his complaint to the authorities. He filed charges, expecting the legal system to vindicate him and restore his property. But the wheels of justice turned slowly in Carroll County, and the Sheltons soon discovered that the Patton family had connections, friendships with local officials, relationships with prominent community members who could influence outcomes in their favor. What should have been a straightforward case of theft became mired in delays, procedural complications, and what the Sheltons perceived as deliberate obstruction. As weeks turned into months, William Shelton's frustration grew into something darker, a conviction that the system was rigged against him, that the law would not protect his family's interests, that he and his sons would have to take matters into their own hands. The Shelton brothers, particularly the older sons who had inherited their father's stubborn pride and quick tempers, began to talk openly about what they would do when they finally got their day in court. This wasn't going to be about legal arguments or evidence presentations. This was going to be about sending a message that would echo through Carroll County for generations. You don't steal from the Sheltons. You don't mock the Sheltons. And you sure as hell don't expect to get away with it. The case was finally scheduled for October 1893 in the Carroll County courthouse in Carrollton. Both families would be present, Both families would have their supporters, and both families, unbeknownst to the unsuspecting citizens of Carrollton, were preparing not for a legal proceeding but for war. The Shelton brothers had made their decision. They would enter that courthouse armed to the teeth, and they would leave only when every man who had wronged them was dead. The stolen mule had become a symbol of everything the Sheltons believed was wrong with their world: the corruption, the favoritism, the sense that hard-working men like them were always getting the short end of the stick. And symbols, as history has shown us time and time again, are worth killing for. As October approached, the tension in Carroll County was palpable. Everyone knew something was going to happen. The question wasn't whether violence would erupt, but how bad it would be when it finally did. October 11th, 1893, dawned clear and cool over Carrollton, Arkansas. The small county seat, with its modest buildings clustered around a central square, was busier than usual. Court day always brought people into town: farmers seeking justice for various disputes, merchants hoping to collect debts, families combining legal business with shopping and socializing. The Carroll County Courthouse, a simple but dignified structure that represented law and order in this frontier region, stood at the center of it all. Nobody entering that building that morning had any idea they were walking into what would become a killing ground. The Shelton brothers arrived early. There were 4 of them present that day. The eldest brothers, who had appointed themselves as enforcers of family honor. Witnesses later reported that they seemed calm, even eerily composed, as they hitched their horses and walked toward the courthouse. But beneath their coats, hidden from casual view, each brother carried an arsenal. Winchester rifles, the legendary gun that won the West, were their primary weapons, along with multiple Colt revolvers as backup. They had enough ammunition to fight a small war, and that's exactly what they intended to do. The preliminary hearings began without incident. The courtroom was packed with spectators, as trials often served as entertainment in rural communities where diversions were few. The Patton family was there in force, confident in their connections and their version of events. Local officials, including Sheriff James Patton, a relation to the defendant family, which only reinforced the Sheltons' belief in systemic corruption, maintained order as the legal proceedings began. Everything seemed normal, routine even, as lawyers made their opening statements and witnesses were called. But the Shelton brothers weren't listening to legal arguments. They were watching, waiting, identifying targets. They had come to this courthouse with a list, not written down, but burned into their memories. Every man who had wronged them, every official who had obstructed justice, every Patton family member who had participated in what they saw as a conspiracy against their family. Each one would pay the ultimate price. The exact sequence of events that followed has been reconstructed from multiple witness accounts, though the chaos and terror of those minutes made precise recollection difficult. What is clear is that the violence began suddenly and with devastating efficiency. One of the Shelton brothers stood up during a routine procedural moment, pulled his Winchester rifle from beneath his coat, and fired the first shot directly into the chest of a Patton family member seated in the gallery. The report of the rifle in the enclosed courtroom was deafening, the shock paralyzing. But the Sheltons didn't pause for shock or hesitation. Within seconds, all 4 brothers had their weapons out and were firing systematically at their chosen targets. The courtroom erupted into pandemonium. People screamed, dove under benches, scrambled for the exits. But the Sheltons had positioned themselves strategically, blocking the main exits, creating a killing zone from which there was no easy escape. They were methodical, almost businesslike, as they worked through their list. One witness later described it as an execution, not a fight. Sheriff Patton, realizing what was happening, drew his own weapon and attempted to restore order. He managed to fire several shots at the Shelton brothers, but in the chaos and confusion, his bullets found only walls and furniture. The Sheltons, meanwhile, were frighteningly accurate. The sheriff fell with multiple bullet wounds, becoming one of the first casualties in what was rapidly becoming a massacre. The violence spilled out of the courtroom and into the courthouse corridors. Men who had managed to escape the initial barrage found themselves hunted through the building. The Sheltons showed no mercy, no hesitation. If you were on their list, if you had wronged their family or stood with those who had, you were marked for death. The Winchester rifles, capable of firing rapidly and holding multiple rounds, turned the courthouse into an abattoir. Blood splattered the walls, pooled on the wooden floors, stained the very documents and legal papers that were supposed to represent civilization and justice. Some of the victims tried to fight back. A few townsmen, including a local merchant and a deputy, managed to retrieve weapons and return fire, but they were disorganized, panicked, and facing men who had come prepared for exactly this confrontation. The Shelton brothers moved with military precision, covering each other, reloading efficiently, maintaining their assault despite the desperate resistance. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst of rage. This was a carefully planned military operation executed with ruthless efficiency. The gunfire seemed to last forever, though in reality the main assault probably lasted less than 10 minutes. When the Sheltons finally ceased firing, when their ammunition was depleted and their list was complete, the courthouse was a scene of unimaginable carnage. Bodies lay scattered throughout the building, in the courtroom, in the hallways, on the steps outside where men had fallen trying to flee. The wounded cried out for help that was slow to come, as survivors cowered in hiding places, terrified that the shooting would resume. 14 men were dead or dying. More than 20 others bore wounds ranging from minor to life-threatening. And the Shelton brothers, their clothes spattered with blood and gunpowder residue, calmly walked out of the courthouse, mounted their horses, and rode out of town before any organized response could be mounted. They had accomplished exactly what they set out to do. They had delivered their message in the most brutal terms possible. This is what happens when you cross the Sheltons. The immediate aftermath of the Carrollton massacre was one of shock, horror, and complete disorganization. The small town had no infrastructure to deal with such a catastrophe. There was no hospital, only a few doctors who were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer number of casualties. The wounded were carried to homes, hotels, and makeshift treatment centers. The dead were laid out in whatever buildings could accommodate them, awaiting identification and burial. Carrollton had become a town of widows, orphans, and traumatized survivors who couldn't quite process what they had just witnessed. News of the massacre spread through Arkansas like wildfire. Telegraph operators worked overtime, sending reports to newspapers across the state and beyond. Within days, the Carrollton Courthouse Massacre, as it came to be known, was national news. Newspapers from New York to San Francisco carried lurid accounts of the violence, often embellishing the already horrific facts. The incident seemed to confirm Eastern prejudices about the Wild West and the lawless nature of frontier territories. Editorial writers used the massacre as evidence that the South and West needed stronger federal intervention, better law enforcement, and a cultural shift away from the honor culture that had produced such violence. But in Arkansas, particularly in Carroll County and the surrounding region, the reaction was more complicated. Yes, there was horror at the scale of the violence and sympathy for the victims and their families, but there was also a significant contingent who understood, if not condoned, what had driven the Shelton brothers to such extremes. The corruption and favoritism in local law enforcement was an open secret. The Patton family's connections and their apparent theft of the Shelton Mule were facts that many community members acknowledged. Some saw the massacre not as senseless violence but as a tragic but inevitable outcome of a system that failed to provide justice to ordinary citizens. This divided public opinion would complicate the manhunt that immediately commenced. Arkansas Governor William Fishback issued a proclamation offering substantial rewards for the capture of the Shelton brothers, dead or alive. A massive posse was organized, drawing from law enforcement agencies across the state. Federal marshals were brought in to coordinate the search. The determination to bring the Sheltons to justice was partly driven by genuine outrage at the murders, but also by a pragmatic political calculation. Arkansas couldn't afford to be seen as a state where such violence went unpunished. The Sheltons, however, had vanished into the Ozark wilderness like ghosts. They knew every hollow, every cave, every hidden trail in those mountains. More importantly, they knew which families would shelter them and which would turn them in. The code of the mountains was strong. You didn't cooperate with authorities, especially when those authorities were seen as corrupt or serving the interests of wealthy and connected families. Numerous families risked prosecution themselves by providing food, shelter, and information to the fugitives. The manhunt stretched on for weeks, then months. There were reported sightings across Arkansas and in neighboring states. Posses chased leads into Missouri, Oklahoma, and Texas. Some reports placed the Sheltons as far away as Mexico or Canada. Each sighting led to raids on homes and interrogations of suspected sympathizers, creating a climate of fear and resentment that further polarized the community. Law enforcement's heavy-handed tactics, breaking into homes without warrants, threatening and occasionally beating those suspected of helping the fugitives, only strengthened support for the Sheltons among people who already distrusted authority. Several close calls nearly brought the manhunt to a violent conclusion. In one incident, a posse surrounded a farmhouse where the Sheltons were reportedly hiding. A brief gunfight erupted before the fugitives escaped through a back window and disappeared into the forest. In another encounter, a lone lawman stumbled upon two of the brothers at a remote cabin. He attempted to make an arrest but was disarmed and sent away with a warning: "Stop chasing us or the next encounter would be fatal." The message was clear. The Sheltons were still armed, still dangerous, and still willing to kill to maintain their freedom. The cost of the manhunt was staggering. The state of Arkansas spent thousands of dollars, a fortune in 1890s currency, on posses, bounties, and investigative efforts. Dozens of lawmen were deployed full-time to the search. Informants were paid for tips that almost always led nowhere. The economic impact on Carroll County was severe, as the notoriety of the massacre scared away potential settlers and businesses. The region gained a reputation for lawlessness and violence that would take decades to overcome. But perhaps the most significant aspect of the manhunt was what it revealed about the fractured nature of law enforcement and justice in rural America. The Sheltons remained free not because law enforcement was incompetent, though there were certainly failures in coordination and strategy, but because a significant portion of the population actively supported them, or at least refused to cooperate with authorities. This wasn't simply a matter of fear, though intimidation played a role. It was a fundamental disagreement about who was in the right and who was in the wrong. As 1893 turned into 1894, the manhunt began to lose momentum. Other crimes demanded attention, political priorities shifted, and the initial outrage faded into resignation. The Shelton brothers had become legends, larger-than-life figures whose exploits were recounted in whispers around fireplaces throughout the Ozarks. They were simultaneously feared as ruthless killers and celebrated as men who had stood up against corruption and refused to be pushed around. The duality of their reputation reflected the moral complexity of their story, a complexity that made simple judgments impossible and justice elusive. The break in the case came not from brilliant detective work or improved law enforcement tactics, but from the inevitable erosion of support that even the most sympathetic fugitives eventually face. By late 1894, more than a year after the massacre, the Shelton brothers were exhausted, paranoid, and running low on resources and safe havens. The network of supporters who had sheltered them was fraying under the constant pressure of law enforcement scrutiny. Several families who had provided aid were facing prosecution themselves, creating resentment and fear that gradually overcame loyalty and ideological sympathy. The first brother to be captured was taken without a fight. He had been hiding in a remote cabin, surviving on minimal supplies, when a posse received a tip about his location. Surrounded and outnumbered, he surrendered peacefully, perhaps relieved that the endless running was finally over. His capture was followed within weeks by the apprehension of two more brothers under similar circumstances. The final brother managed to evade capture for several more months, but eventually he too was cornered and taken into custody. The trials of the Shelton brothers became sensational media events. The courtroom in Little Rock, where the proceedings were moved due to the impossibility of finding impartial jurors in Carroll County, was packed with spectators, journalists, and the curious. The legal strategy employed by the defense was innovative for its time. They argued that the brothers had been driven to violence by systematic corruption and denial of justice. They presented evidence of the Patton family's connections to local law enforcement, documented the theft of the Mule, and portrayed their clients as men who had been pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. The prosecution, meanwhile, emphasized the premeditated nature of the attack. The number of innocent victims, and the threat to civilized society that such violence represented. They brought in survivors to testify about the horror they had witnessed, describing in graphic detail how the Sheltons had methodically hunted down and executed unarmed men. Medical experts testified about the nature of the wounds, making clear that this was not a spontaneous fight, but a calculated massacre. Public opinion remained deeply divided. Newspapers across the country editorialized about the case, with northern publications generally calling for harsh punishment, while some southern papers expressed sympathy for the brothers' grievances, if not their methods. The trial became a proxy for larger debates about justice, honor culture, corruption, and the role of law enforcement in rural America. The verdict, when it finally came, surprised no one but satisfied few. The brothers were found guilty of murder, but the jury, perhaps reflecting the community's ambivalence, recommended mercy. The judge, bound by the jury's recommendation but also aware of public pressure for harsh punishment, handed down sentences of life imprisonment rather than death. The Sheltons would spend the rest of their lives behind bars, but they would keep their lives. But the story didn't end there. In the culture of the Ozarks, where blood feuds could span generations and wrongs were never forgotten, the massacre had created new cycles of violence and revenge. Family members of the victims, unsatisfied with the legal outcome and convinced that the Sheltons deserved death, began planning their own form of justice. Anonymous threats were delivered to the prison where the brothers were held. There were rumors of plots to break into the facility and execute the prisoners extrajudicially. The authorities took these threats seriously, and the Shelton brothers were moved multiple times to different prisons across Arkansas, each transfer conducted in secret to prevent ambushes. But the desire for vengeance proved patient and persistent. In one documented incident, a group of masked men attempted to break into a prison transport wagon, armed with weapons and clearly intent on killing the Sheltons. Only the quick action of guards and the timely arrival of reinforcements prevented what would have been a lynching. The broader community impact of the massacre extended far beyond the immediate parties involved. Carroll County saw an exodus of families, unwilling to raise children in a place associated with such violence. Property values plummeted. The courthouse where the massacre occurred had to be extensively renovated, but many residents reported feeling uncomfortable entering the building, as if the violence had permanently stained the space. Some claimed to hear ghostly sounds, screams, gunshots, echoing through the corridors at night, though such reports were likely more psychological than supernatural in nature. The legal system itself underwent reforms partly in response to the massacre. Arkansas implemented new procedures for handling cases involving potential conflicts of interest, established oversight mechanisms for rural sheriffs, and created appellate review processes for criminal cases. These reforms came too late to help the Sheltons or their victims, but they represented an acknowledgement that the system had failed and that changes were necessary to prevent future tragedies. The Shelton brothers adapted to prison life with varying degrees of success. Some reports suggest that they remained unrepentant, convinced that they had done what honor demanded. Others indicated that at least some of the brothers expressed regret for the innocent lives lost, even if they maintained that their core grievance had been justified. They became model prisoners in some respects, avoiding disciplinary problems and working prison jobs with diligence. But they also remained marked men, always aware that even behind bars, the desire for revenge never truly died. The Shelton brothers would all die in prison, their sentences never commuted, their freedom never restored. The last brother passed away in the 1920s, more than 3 decades after the massacre that had destroyed so many lives. But their story, and the violence they unleashed on that October day in 1893, left a legacy that extended far beyond their individual fates. The Carrollton massacre became a cautionary tale, referenced in debates about gun control, law enforcement reform, and the dangers of honor culture. Sociologists and historians studied the incident as an example of how quickly civilized society could break down when institutions failed to provide justice, and when cultural values prioritized personal honor over rule of law. The massacre was used as evidence in arguments both for stronger central authority and for better local governance. Different observers drew different lessons from the same bloody events. For the families directly affected, the impact was generational. Children who lost fathers in the massacre grew up in poverty and struggle, their lives fundamentally altered by those minutes of violence. Some harbored lifelong resentment, passing down stories of the Sheltons as monsters who had destroyed their families. Others, particularly in later generations, came to see the incident as a tragedy in which everyone was a victim. The men who died, the brothers who spent their lives in prison, and a community that was torn apart by failures of justice and governance. The physical scars on Carrollton eventually healed. The courthouse was renovated and continued to serve as the center of county government. Bloodstains were scrubbed away, bullet holes were patched, and life returned to a semblance of normalcy. But the psychological and cultural scars proved more persistent. For decades, the massacre hung over the community like a dark cloud. Outsiders associated Carroll County with violence and lawlessness. Economic development was stunted by the region's reputation. Young people left for opportunities elsewhere, unwilling to build lives in a place marked by such tragedy. The legend of the Shelton brothers evolved over time, as legends do. In some tellings, they became noble rebels fighting against corruption and injustice, men who had been pushed too far and who stood up for their rights when no one else would. In other versions, they were psychopathic killers who used a minor grievance as an excuse for mass murder. The truth, as always, was more complex than either extreme. They were men shaped by their culture and circumstances, men who made catastrophic choices that destroyed their own lives and the lives of countless others. Modern scholars examining the Carrollton massacre have noted its place in a larger pattern of violence in the post-Civil War South. The breakdown of traditional authority structures, the poverty and desperation of the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction eras, the prevalence of weapons, and the cultural emphasis on personal honor and family loyalty all contributed to an environment where disputes could escalate rapidly from verbal disagreements to lethal violence. The Shelton brothers were not unique. They were products of their time and place, though their actions were extreme even by the standards of that violent era. The massacre also raises uncomfortable questions about justice and revenge that remain relevant today. Were the Sheltons right that the legal system had failed them? Almost certainly, the evidence of corruption and favoritism in Carroll County law enforcement was substantial. But did that failure justify their response? The 14 dead men and the dozens of wounded, many of whom had no direct involvement in the mule theft or the legal proceedings, stand as tragic testament to the answer. Violence, particularly indiscriminate violence, destroys more than it repairs. It creates new injustices, new grievances, new cycles of revenge. The story of the Shelton brothers and the Carrollton massacre serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of civilized society. It takes years, sometimes generations, to build institutions of justice and governance that people trust. But that trust can be destroyed in moments when those institutions are perceived as corrupt or ineffective. And once that trust is lost, once people decide they must take justice into their own hands, the resulting violence can be swift, brutal, and utterly devastating. Today, the Carrollton massacre is largely forgotten outside of local Arkansas history. The courthouse still stands, now housing county offices and serving as a reminder of both the tragedy and the resilience of the community. A small historical marker notes the events of October 11, 1893, though it understates the horror of what actually occurred. Descendants of both the Shelton family and the victims still live in the region, though most have moved on from the old feuds and resentments. But for those who study American history, particularly the history of violence and justice in rural America, the Carrollton massacre remains a powerful case study. It demonstrates how quickly things can go wrong when law enforcement is corrupt, when economic stress creates desperation, when cultural values prioritize honor over compromise, and when access to weapons makes it easy to transform anger into mass casualty violence. These lessons, uncomfortable as they may be, remain relevant in contemporary America, where many of the same factors, distrust of institutions, economic anxiety, honor culture in some communities, and widespread gun ownership, continue to shape our society. The Shelton brothers killed 14 men over a stolen mule, but really, They killed 14 men over something much deeper, a sense of powerlessness, a conviction that the system was rigged against them, a belief that violence was the only language that would be heard and respected. That story, that tragedy, echoes through American history and challenges us to build better systems of justice, to address grievances before they escalate, and to recognize that in the end, violence only begets more violence, leaving nothing but blood, grief, and unanswered questions in its wake. The Carrollton massacre stands as one of the darkest chapters in Arkansas history, a day when frontier justice turned into wholesale slaughter, when the failure of institutions led to the deaths of 14 men, and when a family's sense of honor transformed into an unquenchable thirst for revenge. If you found this deep dive into American history compelling, please like this video and share it with anyone interested in true crime and historical tragedies. What other historical events should we explore? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.